Hey everybody, Owen here from the Lardcore team, and welcome back to what is to be our longest video yet. While planning our upcoming videos, I actually came across an old design presentation that I'd actually sent to the team back in 2022. Now, this was at a time where I hadn't actually officially joined the project yet, and you can tell that it's old because we were still referring to the game as Reheated, not Lardcore. Anyway, rather than deleting this piece of media, we thought it might be nice to share it with you all here on YouTube to help highlight a lot of the design points that we had in mind at the time and have proceeded to address since then. I give you the Design Dossier Archive. Enjoy! Hey guys, and welcome to my Hogs Reheated Design Input and Focus Areas presentation. Originally this was just going to be a PowerPoint presentation for you guys to look at, but I figured why not put it into video form as well and discuss some of the points I mentioned here in more detail. This is essentially a compilation of the key things that come to my mind when looking at Reheated as a final product. So what are the main things that you can take from the original, what are the things that are iconic in terms of design, and what areas can be focused on to enhance the final product of Hogs Reheated. So the main points of discussion, there's quite a few. Like I said, just an overall breakdown of the key areas. So pig design, pickups, vehicles, buildings and assets, weapons, particle effects, map space and storytelling, front-end UI, specifically the briefing screens, and finally taking a look at the screenshots, most recent ones that were sent to me by Steve, and just noting down my thoughts and questions that I have for you guys, which we'll get to at the end. Of course, first up being the pig designs, specifically quite a bit in just trying to get across the importance of the pigs themselves, because when I saw them initially in the prototype, my main concern was the fact that they had, small black eyes, which initially made me think, well, how much expression can be shown from that compared to the original models. You had the white iris and then the dark eyes. You can see all the facial expressions on the side, and they were clear and precise, and they went hand in hand with the gameplay. So sometimes it was comical, where the expressions would just rapidly flip between happy, angry, sad, so there was a comical element to it, but there was also the gameplay element. So when pigs were damaged, they'd show the negative emotions of fear and sadness and anger, and then there was there was kind of a middle ground of, say, if you poisoned a pig, it would flip between being happy and confused, so just getting that balance right with the facial expression, and also not producing something a bit too scary, which, as you can see, the early facial expressions from the early hog models were. I mean, it was only the single expression, but you can see how the eyes can be quite terrifying. I don't know if it had eyebrows. It doesn't look like it, but yes, just some thoughts there on the facial expressions. It still terrifies me, that face. So next up, still within the pig design area, is the ears. Now, again, my other initial thought when seeing those early models was how rounded everything looked. The pig was quite squishy, and the ears in particular were quite stumpy. And that seems to be the same from the pig models that were in those screenshots, which again, still look like the early ones. Correct me if I'm wrong. But the original models, I know there was a lack of polys, but the pointy ear, getting that pointy-eared look, especially from behind, the player's mainly going to be seeing the back of this pig's head. So my initial thinking is, does it look like a pig? And in some ways, the original models, the ears are very bat-like. And I know that we have more polys to play with, but I just think they could maybe be made a bit larger and a bit pointier. I also looked at the comparison between the PlayStation and PC version. I know that the PC version had more polys to play with, so the ears still maintained that pointiness, but were also a bit more defined. But the other thing I would mention is don't be afraid to play around with the ear size depending on the class. As for instance, you'll see on that right side picture the heavy weapons pigs' ears were actually smaller, and they pointed outwards more compared to other pigs because of the helmet. So don't be afraid to change the size and play around with the size and pointiness of certain classes. Something could be done there, in kind of making them more characteristic rather than just being the same model used across multiple classes, if that makes sense. In relation to the ears, like I just said, the helmets and hats are very important, and they do give a bit more creative freedom in this sense, because originally it was only the heavy weapons pigs that had very individual helmets, which links in relation to the theme of the game being that of World War I, World War II. So, you see the Adrian helmet on the French, that sort of army drill instructor sergeant type hat on the Americans, the Team Lard helmet with the horns being just completely original and individual to that team. But yeah, the biggest problem the original had was that the majority of pigs in the game had the same type of cadet style hat. It was only different in the texture itself. So there's a lot more creative freedom in trying to define those classes a bit more and play to the strengths of those classes. So if it's a medic, give them maybe a mask, or like a nurse's hat. Just being able to play around with that, but in 3D form, I think would be a big plus. And I feel like the community would welcome that as well, because that's been a lot of the points that have been brought up in relation to like customization and stuff like that, is being able to see those pigs and classes more defined and more detailed within their specific field. Having said that, it also brings up 2 points of, does the headwear or design of it fit the aesthetic of the game, so World War I and World War II, and also does it fit the aesthetic of the chosen team and match it, like I said a moment ago, with those individual nations, and if it fits that style of that specific nation. Then there's the other idea, still related to that of helmets and hats and stuff, is looking at the strongest, I say strongest, the most popular types of headwear in Hogs, and maybe combining them. As an example, you can see here, when you complete the final mission, there is a pig model that is only shown here, and it appears to have a combination of the elite pig's cap, so like an officer's hat, with the additional horns from the Team Lard gunner or heavy weapons. And a lot of people really like this combination. So I don't know if you'd like to maybe look at the final, I guess, boss. I say boss. One of the most closely resembling bosses, I guess, that Hogs has, which is the heavy weapons pig called Izzy on the final mission. Because the main question you get when you play that final level for the first time is, whoa, there's a purple team. Like, why is there a purple team, and why is this pig Izzy significant? What's the story there? Because there isn't really any story there, but you still look at that purple pig as being significant at that point in the gameplay. But either way, it's just an idea. The Team Lard pig can still be kept as it is if it's just easier, but in terms of defining Izzy a little bit more, making him look a bit more menacing, I think that could be a nice little touch. So then we have the additional details of the backpack. Now this is particularly important to some regard in relation to the speed of each pig. Now it doesn't always mean the size of the backpack equals that this pig is faster or slower, but it does have this sort of strange placebo effect of, the lighter a pig looks, the faster they move. And that's particularly true with the elite pigs, and it's particularly true with the heavy weapons pigs, which I'll get onto in a minute. But you can see that the backpacks are all different shapes and sizes, and they also go hand in hand with the specific texture and primary and secondary colors of each team. So you can see from left to right, the commandos and the spies are specifically more detailed than the lower ranked classes of the grunt and the, I guess, an orderly there. The color palette is also important because there is a difference between each team. Given that the Tommy, Sushi Swine, the Uncle Hams, and Piggy Striker, their backpacks tend to be a lot lighter, earthier tones, browns, dark browns, and with the gold finish, which I think is across all teams actually. But the Sauerkrauts and Garlic Grunts having a darker tone to complement their darker colors, being that of grey and dark blue. But yeah, color palette is also very important here as well. As I mentioned, bigger usually feels heavier, and that is certainly the case for the heavy weapons backpack, as it's the biggest backpack, and it's the only backpack that extends above the neck, as you can see here. This is actually the PC version, or PC textures of Team Lard, which is why it's not green and purple as their primary and secondary colors. Instead, it's red and purple. But yeah, for this class specifically, the backpack needs to be big and it needs to feel heavy, especially when you move the character. I know the tank controls and the speed of this class kind of add to its feeling of heaviness anyway, but you want to be able to look at that character model and know instantly that that is a big, powerful dude. Next up is health crates, and just the crate section of this breakdown. Initially, when I looked at the early crate models, my first thought went to Crash Bandicoot, because they had that very high saturation and they weren't utilizing the original things that made health crates so distinct, being that of its shape, because it's not a simple box. It is a long rectangle that's quite thin, and of course the most iconic part of that crate is the hearts on every single face of the rectangle itself. So next up is the weapon and espionage crates. These fall into the same category of iconicness as the health crate in regards to the symbology that is used. So that bomb symbol on the main weapon crate and the question mark on the espionage / random crate, because originally the espionage crate was used in two different ways. First of all, if any pig would hide, it would turn into the crate with a question mark on it, and those question mark crates were also used as weapon crates, specifically random crates that could be found on some multiplayer maps. One of the things all these crates share as well, including the health crate, is that they aren't oversaturated. They're kind of dim and gritty, which I think is perfect really, because you have the bright colors everywhere else with the team uniforms, the foliage, and they don't necessarily need to stand out a huge amount on the battlefield because the player has the minimap there already to tell them exactly where it is. I also included the unused crates. These I believe were only found on the PC version, but of course were never used. They're a weird one, and if any of you guys would like to have the 3D models for any of the unused stuff that I show in this presentation, then do let me know. I can send those over as well if you don't have them already. But yeah, I just thought I'd include them because here you can see a really thick lid, and then the actual square model uses the sandbag texture, which is used on the sandbags and on the shelters, which I found to be a bit weird. So on to vehicles, starting with the tank. I feel like the original shape of this vehicle cannot be abandoned, or I say abandoned, I would take it into close consideration when trying to put together the tank in Reheated. The main detail that all of the vehicles have in the original Hogs is the sharp edges. You know, everything is very box-like and square, and I know that was partially down to the polygon count, but I feel like if you go to the other end of that and try and make things, again, just as I mentioned with the pig models, if you try and make them too rounded and squishy, they lose that grittiness that the original game held deeply within its theme. I think the color palette is really important in the vehicles as well. You can see that there's some camo on the side of the tank, and that's carried through with the other vehicles as well. But my main thinking here is that if you go too far one way or the other with the color of the vehicle, and maybe it gets too close and resembles a certain team, players might get confused and think, well, if that tank is blue, then surely it must belong to a specific team, so, can I use it? Basically just trying to avoid confusion and make it distinct in what it is, and like, both teams can use that, because again, I'm just thinking of things that the original didn't really explain. Like, for instance, that, okay, if you've got two sides of a map that are split with a minefield and you've got tanks either side, well, the tanks over there, they must belong to the enemy, but can I use them? And these tanks that are mine, can the enemy use those, But yeah, just the importance of neutral colours in relation to vehicles. So again, the Aqua Tank, I would follow the same rules here in relation to textures, but I do feel like there is a lot more room here in terms of the 3D design. There are some strengths you can take from it, like you've got those nozzles, those pipes coming up from the Aqua Tank, and there's a nice little anchor symbol on there, so there's a small amount of detail to make it seem like it can traverse across water, but at the same time the shape is exactly the same as the tank, that sort of thin rectangle again being used, and the tracks along the bottom of the tank in order to allow it to move and stuff. I just feel like the 3D can really shine through here in keeping the strengths from the original and kind of expanding on the shape a bit. Like, okay, it's an Aqua Tank, so does it necessarily need to be square? Does it need to have those rounded edges? And if we look at the miniatures game example, you can see it does exactly that. So it copies the shape, but things are a lot more rounded. It works a lot more here. The tracks on the bottom, the wheels, they're a lot more detailed, and it still has that long gun. Like, the gun shape changes, because I didn't include the gun on the rendered image, but they both the tank and the Aqua Tank use the same gun barrel. Ultimately, it's like the pig designs I was mentioning. Like, the player needs to be able to look at this vehicle and know instantly what it is and what it can do. So the trucks and ducks, these are the rarest vehicles in the entire game, and extremely underutilized because they're only used on one mission each in the single player campaign. And again, they follow the same kind of style. You can see that the duck is a bit more rounded there on the right. The truck, again, is quite unique in its design and its textures, which is quite nice. And it's a bit wider. It's more square rather than rectangle. But the duck kind of does the same thing as the Aqua Tank, just without the gun, essentially. So again, plenty of room for more creative freedom here, and just being able to define them a bit more. And I would personally like to request that the truck and duck be added into multiplayer, but specifically into generated maps, because when you use generated maps, you can decide how many vehicles will spawn in the level, but those only include the Aqua Tank, the tank, the pillbox, and the artillery. So the truck and duck are just left in single player. So I think it would help to create a different method of play, and generally just add something more to multiplayer in particular, because even though these vehicles don't have guns, they are still pretty integral to the missions in single player, and I think they would translate quite nicely into multiplayer and that experience as well, because the more the merrier. Onto buildings and shelters. This is more just a breakdown of the key parts of the building that I find to be the most iconic, being that of the materials that are used in the texture. So the sandbags, again, that link between the World War I theme and just the other materials. You've got like metal sheets on the sides, and just keeping within that design frame, that texture design frame of using materials that you can associate with war, and specifically that period of history and that war that went on during that time. Also, another personal request, I'm sure you've probably found it by now, but the shelter, its hitbox is not centered. So there is one side of it where a pig will, if they run into it, they'll basically hit an invisible wall, even though there is space in front of them to maneuver. I can't remember which side it is, but please fix it, because it's really annoying. Next up is the unused building that is the bunker. This is only found on the unused map known as High Road. Its HP is unknown, and essentially a lot of the details about it are unknown. No idea why it only exists in this map, in the map data. I don't know if the original file still exists anywhere, because I haven't been able to come across it. But you can see from the images that it is a combination of both the pillbox and the shelter. So it provides that armor with the HP, but it has a slot on the back where the players can shoot from. They can't rotate it, so you can only fire from a specific direction. But I do think it warrants some investigation within Reheated. It could be a nice addition, because again, there is a distinct lack of specific buildings in the original. You've only got tents and shelters. That's basically it. I think having that combination of a building and a weapon/vehicle could be interesting and could certainly change gameplay. Obviously, it would require a lot of playtesting as well to see if it could work or could be valid. Maybe it could have more HP but less weaponry, so you rely on it more as its primary purpose of a building. But you know, if you get the chance, you could fire upon an enemy from that building itself. Either way, food for thought. So the swill is, of course, the main thing that you're chasing after in the single player campaign, and is perhaps the most iconic asset in the entire game, or at least in single player. I know that I've talked to Louisa, I've talked to her off about this and its importance on the final mission, because you go through the entire campaign and you don't see a single swill until you reach that final mission, and then they're in this like creepy circle. You don't know what the hell they are or what they do. Well, you know what they do, but you don't necessarily need to know how they do what they do, in that yes, they're an oil swill, they're gathering oil. Why does it have a pipe in the middle of it? I mean, I guess for the oil to come out, maybe. I don't know. You know, these are the things that I always thought of as a kid, but I'm not really caring about the mechanics of it, but the importance of the visuals of this swill, how it looks, how it's laid out. The face on top is a must, and everything else around that could maybe be tweaked a bit, but the overall shape of it, like you can see, it's this, you know, tall, menacing, scary looking pig. During development of the original game back during the beta version, there was an unused version of the swill. Now, this was placed in a handful of missions, but was eventually removed, I'm guessing because of too high a poly count, maybe in individual levels. I'm not entirely sure, but regardless, rather than having a big scary pig face, it had an exhaust, kind of like the chimney on top of the windmill, and it did emit a little smoke particle, which was a nice touch as well. Now, this is really important to me because I've always liked the idea of it, and I'll tell you why and what that idea is in a few slides' time. Other unused assets, we have sandbags and barbed wire. Now, barbed wire is technically not unused, it's more underused because you can only find it on the training mission in single player. And sandbags, again, was another asset that made it into the alpha/beta stage of development before it was removed. It was intended to be used in the same way as a building, in that it could provide a certain amount of armor before then being able to be destroyed. But it was also used as far back as the very first version of the game back in 1998. But I feel like rather than looking to use it as its original form, sandbags could be used as a really nice addition to window dressing of certain levels. So if you look at this old screenshot from the first version of the game, this is mission 17, and you can see there's just that little cluster of detail amongst the sandbags. So you've got barrels there, crates there, there's a little fuel canister there as well. But yeah, I feel like sandbags could be a nice addition to adding detail to specific levels because there is plenty of space. Other unused assets are the civilian. This was only used on the PC version, again on a handful of missions. It was used in the final version, and you can find it if you play the Steam version of the PC version of Hogs of War. But the civilian was placed inside buildings, usually metal ones, because you you can kind of get a bit distracted by the civilian because it's it's a new thing. But you'll find him sat in a building in front of a TV with a lampshade, which I thought was a nice detail. But you can see the models here as well, and it was a nice little touch. It was the only done by the PC version, by the guys that put the PC version together. And again, I'm guessing because they had the extra polys to play with, they thought, why not add more detail? And the civilian is a nice touch. He's sleeping. He's not dead. But it just makes you think about kind of being able to expand the wider universe a little bit and know that, where you're fighting, there are civilians, or there have been civilians. Because the original planned to have multiple different characters, including militia and female pigs and scientists. So I don't know. You could maybe look at certain places inside buildings on different missions where that detail could be added and maybe expanded upon even more. Next up is the unused asset of the sheep. This was played with up until the just past the demo stage, so it almost made it into the final version of the game, but sadly was taken out. The sheep itself would kind of jump around the level, and if you shot at it, it would explode and it could damage pigs that were near it. But if you killed a sheep, technically, or made it explode, another one would instantly drop from the sky and continue to act as the sheep does. I think it could be another detail to expand upon the world that the hogs are fighting in, kind of make it a bit more real. And I think the sheep could be added at least into multiplayer. I think, again, just kind of like the ducks and trucks, it's underutilized. It's a cool thing that could be wacky and less about the campaign, more about the fun multiplayer. The sheep for multiplayer. Maybe it can be a new class. No, I'm kidding, but it was used in Mission 15. So if you want to look at examples of it, I have made videos on the sheep already and tutorials on how to access it. Again, if you're interested, just to see how it functions and whatnot. But next up is my weapon breakdown. So these are, I guess, the most iconic weapons that I see from the original in terms of their design and how I see them in game. So starting with the heavy machine gun, it's a big gun. Size does matter here apparently, because you've got the heavy machine gun, you've got the regular machine gun, but the regular machine gun was just a standard Tommy gun. So I think there's not really much detail to be added there, but the heavy machine gun is one where its original design is important, because if you look at the next screenshot, you can see why, right? It's comical in its size, so it has that humor aspect, but you also know exactly what this weapon can do. It's a big weapon, it's gonna deal big damage if used in the right way, so I think trying to, at least size-wise, play around with it, see what you can do. The flamethrower, it's funky. There are a lot of canisters. There's a lot of polygons there, and ironically, it's not something that the player could actually see very well because of the camera controls in terms of the detail of this weapon. But I feel like it is another iconic one, just in its wacky design. Like it does kind of fit the World War I setting. Like if you look at early flamethrowers, they have that long nozzle, the large canisters, so I think sticking with that could be pretty helpful. Now the pistol is distinct in its color palette more than anything else. I mean, the 3D model is generic. It's a combination actually of 3D and 2D, because the handle is just a 2D plane with a texture slapped on it. But the color palette here is interesting because it's got that sort of copper green hue. And that to me has become synonymous with the heavy weapons pig, because he has the pistol. That's the only class that has the pistol. Why is it green? I don't know, but I like it. The jetpack, it's a very wacky, item, ability, I guess, usable item, and it's not something that you think of when you think gritty World War One setting, but it's so wacky in its design and distinct with that red and white stripe, that kind of firecracker-esque design, and then the main base just being this square bolted thing. You have no idea how it works, but you don't really care because just the stripiness and the brightness of this. I think the shape especially can't be ignored. The textures maybe could be improved, but again, you look at it and you instantly think firecracker, that it can fly, that it's gonna emit some kind of fume, exhaust fume, and it looks like a rocket, so you know what's gonna happen. The super shotgun and to some extent the regular shotgun are super iconic weapons in Hogs, partially due to their shape and instantly, being able to recognize it through the shape of the weapon and the texture used, what it actually is. But a large percentage of that as well is just because the super shotgun can allow players to shoot pigs 1,000 miles into the air. But it is super iconic, one, because of its color, that gold and rifle brown combination, and also because of its end shape. It's very musket-like, and has that sort of expanding diamond shape, which is different to all of the other standard rifles that you find in Hogs. The sword, it's one that I guess isn't really that important, but I do have an idea for this weapon in that the color palette used on the handle could match the primary and secondary colors of the team you are using. So specifically for the Hero Aesir Legend, you can see the Tommy Strotters is red and green, Garlic Grunts blue and purple, Piggy Striker red and blue, Sushi Swine yellow and orange, Sauerkraut's grey and dark green, and Uncle Ham's sky blue and yellow/gold. So it's a small detail, but one that I think could nicely match the uniforms of the pigs. So next up, I've got 2 videos to show you of the particle effect that I find to be the most important to get right in Hogs, and of course that is explosions. So first up, this is from the PC version. Apologies, the quality isn't amazing, but I'm just wanting to show the main explosion that you'd see from a bazooka or an airburst, and kind of what the default explosion is set to in both the PC and PlayStation versions. So like I said, here we have the PC version. And then next up we have the PlayStation version. So having just watched those 2 videos displaying the particle effects used across both versions of Hogs, I wanted to discuss why I feel the PlayStation version's particle effect for the explosions of both, well, basically all the heavy weapon types, is way more impactful than the PC version. The PC version, because the particles are very light and they use white essentially in the particle effect color, it feels less impactful, it feels less heavy, and feels light and floaty compared to the PlayStation version. You can see on the image on the right there, the particle effect is black and has whispers of orange and red, and those outstretched streaks of black and fire, essentially, but then you look at the one on the left and it's just this giant ball, this giant smoky cloud, which again just has this it removes that feeling of heaviness. You know, you're shooting this really big shell, and then I don't know. For me, it combines with the frame rate as well. I remember discussing this with Luke when I was up there with you guys in the Steel Minion studio. Just how the frame rate can really impact gameplay in terms of weight. And that refers to both the use of weaponry, but also moving pigs as well. And just sort of feeling that the game is quite heavy. When I played it on 60 FPS or, you know, just relatively high frame rate, everything felt too quick and light to me, you know, and it's a strange one because a lot of the people in the community that I've spoken to tend to agree on this. There's become this consensus among players that having higher frame rates and faster gameplay feels odd, and it feels like in a lot of ways, especially when you're using heavy weapons and the power bar comes up, you have less time to think about when to stop using the weapon, so when to release and fire the weapon, because you have a small window of holding down the button and seeing the power bar go up, but that becomes even smaller. That window becomes smaller when you're playing on high frames, and we've kind of tested it as well in the community, playing on emulators, increasing the frame rate. I've had it as well playing on the beta version because that one ran at a much higher frame rate, and in general it was just tougher to kind of get my head around and maintain that feeling of weight in the weapons that I was using. So next up is storytelling through detail of map space. This is something that I've tried to talk about in my videos on my channel, getting into the mindset that I do when I make my mods is observing a map space and seeing what detail I can put into it. Of course, I'm limited because I'm using the original game. I'm modding the original game, so I'm limited to the objects that exist already in those levels, and of course limited by the poly count as well, because there's only so much that I can add. So what I do is I break it down into internal and external space. So internal space, of course, being the playable area. What components have you got at your disposal to add detail to both the setting of the mission through existing assets, and basically looking at whether you can create further context through those assets in that playable space. So what can those existing assets tell the player in relation to both the context of the mission, and can it provide a new experience or different type of gameplay? Because, you know, you look at the buildings, you can use those to block incoming damage, to stay away from certain players. So can those assets bring that to the table as well? The other side of that coin is the potential negative impact on the AI pathing, because they tend to be pretty dumb, especially around walls and buildings. They will run into things and continue to run into things even if it's in the way. They'll shoot at things that are directly in front of them. Essentially, they're very dumb and not very clever, so sometimes additional detail can be hampered by the AI and just their stupid decisions. So after that, we've got external details. Now, looking at the original map textures, there were a lot of areas where paths just kind of led to the edge of the map and there was nothing there. There was no additional detail. So you could look at the external areas, the non-playable areas, the outer bounds areas where additional assets could be placed. And this relates back to what I was saying about the unused swill, in that, you know, the overall story of the game involves swill. Pigs are fighting for swill and oil, so why not place, you know, swills on different levels, on different missions other than mission 25? In essence, it is a strong callback to the overall story and creates, you know, this more grounded sense of, okay, this is what I'm fighting for. I can see it in front of me. I can see that these lands around me are rich with swill. So yeah, could be helpful. Next up is the UI. Specifically, I picked out the briefing screens here more because of the negativeness of the original briefing screen. Is negativeness a word? I don't know. But regardless, the original briefing screens weren't great. They were quite sparse, but they did have one strength in kind of providing a little window into the individual levels. So I think having those pictures there highlighting the main things to look out for in the level is really important, especially to new players as well that don't know what to expect going into the level. I suspect you've probably already got your own kind of style or layout as to how you're going to have your own briefing screens. Maybe you'll look to copy these in some regard as well. I know that I did. I tried to maintain this briefing screen style, as you'll see in my own examples, where I modified the existing front-end UI screen. But then I did shift. So these are from my version 4 of my mod. So these are some of my latest ones where I've been able to add more images. I've stuck with, there being a piece of paper that gives you the briefing. You have the images in combination with the little note that, gives you a hint to something. But yeah, that's just kind of how I've expanded things, and I'm sure you guys have your own ideas, but yeah, I'm curious to see. So on to the screenshots that Steve sent me, and I went into the editor and immediately grabbed what I thought was a rough comparison shot to the reheated shot on the left, just to see the differences, because I don't know, I just thought it would be important to see how much has been added, because I'm excited from the looks of those screenshots. They look insanely good. The particle effects of the water, the skybox is wonderful, and just the massive amount of detail that has been put into it already, especially the grass around the water. I love that. But despite these strong impressions, I do have some thoughts when analyzing these screenshots, and of course made me raise a few questions. So my first thought is, would less equal more? Because you look at the screenshot on the bottom right of the screen, and there is a lot going on. So I know I've mentioned throughout this presentation that the original maps were quite sparse, but they were straightforward. The player was easily able to distinguish what areas were walkable and what areas could not be walked on through the combination of textures. So my question is, would adding too much blur that line between what is easily defined to the player in regards to traversing the level? Number 2, how do the pigs interact with rock assets? So my first thought, seeing the rocks on these screenshots kind of jutting out from the landscape, it's a great detail, but I'm immediately concerned by how the pigs will interact with them in gameplay. Again, the rock textures, you knew if you stood on them or tried to run up them as a player that you would immediately slip down. So how do they interact with them? If you stand on them, do you slip off them? Again, I'm concerned about collision, because maybe there's going to be a lot of areas where the pig is going to fall between rocks. You can try and you can try and make it as compact as you can, and add the detail on top of the rock space or texture or area. But I have to also say, in regards to gameplay, those flat surfaces that were slippery were important in relation to knockback, because if you remove that by adding those details of the rocks, so for instance, if you just make an area inaccessible and the pig can't jump on it or whatever, then it's really going to impact gameplay. And point number 3, are all of the areas in the level accessible to the player? Specifically here, the main area that I'm focused on are those points where the land meets the water's edge, because across this mission, which is mission 2 in the screenshots, players are able to walk along the entire edge of that surface between land and water. So if you have rocks that are jutting out from certain areas and blocking or obstructing or reducing that playable space, it may seem minute, but in the grand scheme of things, I'm mainly looking at under the bridges here, by the way. In the grand scheme of things, it can massively impact gameplay and routes that the player can take. So I know it's going to require more playtesting, but yeah, overall, screenshots and the way things are looking compared to how I saw them like 2 years ago, it's a massive improvement. And again, I'm not trying to belittle anything that has been done thus far. I'm just pointing out the main areas that I'm thinking of whilst looking at these awesome screenshots. But yeah, thanks for listening. I know this video is probably way too long than what I would have wanted it to be, but I hope you guys found it helpful. I have a ton of more points to make about stuff from the original that can be handy in Reheated. I've got a lot of thoughts and ideas in relation to other areas like lighting and setting the mood with like weather and stuff like that. Just a ton of different ideas. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on everything, and speak to you guys soon.